Hey there YouTube, I'm Ikitsu, this is Ikitsu Times, welcome to my channel, and welcome to a little bit of Age of Wonders Planetfall. So today we're going to be talking about the Shakarn with Promethean, and I don't think Promethean's necessarily their most interesting combination. I think Shakarn runs into a slight problem as far as interesting combinations goes, but we'll go into that in a little bit more depth later on, potentially. So anyhow, let's jump in by looking at their units. Just because they have got some new units, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about them than usual. So first of all, you have got access to the Shakarn Recon here. It's just called Recon. Sonopulse for 7 damage. Has Stagger on a Scout, which is pretty interesting. They're actually pretty decent. There's some mods that can make them pretty okay, but I still wouldn't say that they're great in a fight. What makes them better than the Vanguard Scout is that the Reconnaissance Boy is just much better than the target mark, in my opinion. You basically pick a target that's quite decent distance away there, and you drop it down, and you get plus 20% accuracy against every target within that radius there, which is a really, really powerful sort of thing to add. And if your opponent decides they can take their time shooting at it, but if they're going to do that, then they're sort of wasting time firing at something that otherwise they wouldn't have to fire at. So it's just, I think, a lot stronger than the Vanguard version of the same sort of thing there. Sorry. Next up is the Shakarn Raider. This is their basic troop type. They're actually pretty beefy looking, but they're not too tough or anything like that. They're nothing too special. Epimorphic Regeneration is a common trait that you're going to find for this faction. When they take a bit of damage, they regain 6 health the next turn, which is pretty powerful. And then there's also the Xeno Debilitation, which has -2 resistance against status effects due to its physiology. So these guys are tough against damage, but they suffer from against status effects a little bit more when compared to other factions. Their weapon is the Omni Carbine, which is pretty special. Instead of having a 7 range repeating attack, you've got a 5 range repeating attack. It's a lot sort of weaker in those long range engagements, especially because the close assault rule means that they're losing a bunch of damage if they're further away as well. So what makes this thing so powerful, though, is that the Omni Carbine is capable of dealing a ton of damage, 14 damage base per shot, which is more than any other basic weapon that you're going to see on a basic troop out there. The problem as well is if you do find ways to increase their damage, they are still going to lose damage. Like if you fired a long-range shot at 7 range somehow with this thing, it would be dealing 7 damage, which would not be great, but it's still a pretty fantastic weapon all in all just because of that, and the unit all in all is pretty good. The Omni Rush ability here is their grenade-like. It's unfortunately, like, this is pretty weak actually. It does have Stagger, does have that chance of applying concussion, which is really good, although the odds are quite low. What's so good about Omni Rush though is that you know, it's pretty high damage, and it's in a 3 hex line, so you can't hit multiple people. It's just that it's not going to be destroying terrain, and it's not really causing as good a pattern for damage when you're assaulting in, like if people sort of lined up in that sort of typical firing line kind of position. Out of all of the units, the Shakarn Raider feels like it has some of the more difficulties getting into prime firing range, because if you get too close, you get meleeed by things that are going to be better than you in melee combat, and if you're sort of stuck further out away, obviously you're not going to be able to fire at all, and you sort of do have to go through people's Overwatch to get your shots off. But once you're in there, this is one of the stronger units, all around pretty fantastic. Next up you have the Infiltrator, and this is a very unique unit in that cannot be modded. Instead what they do is they use Holo Shift, and they get the abilities of the unit that they're Holo Shifted into, and that includes their mods. Their base gun, when they're not doing that, is just a shotgun type attack. They're pretty good range. It's actually not a terrible weapon all in all, but you definitely want to Holo Shift these guys into a much more powerful, more effective unit. Despite the fact that they have no mod slots and they're not able to get any of that, you can actually give these guys a bunch of buffs from things like lifelike holograms and weighted holograms, so they can get some other interesting bonuses to make them more powerful. These guys are that sort of stereotypical like lizard person conspiracy from like They Live or something like that. Anyhow, next up you have the Shakarn Deadeye. I have no idea what these things are actually for. They've basically got a long-range shotgun, I guess. It's an okay amount of damage, nothing too special. Good range, 7 range, but it's essentially an assault weapon since it's a single action, so you can move up and then you can fire it, but why would you need to? Because it's got 7 range already. So it's a really weird weapon. I'm not too sure about that. Their alternate fire is the Omni Perforator, which is a line attack. It can get you out to a 9 range shot, which I guess is pretty nice, but it's not very much damage. It does penetrate 2 points of armor, which means that's the same as their Omni Cannon generic shot in a certain sense there. But all in all, this is kind of a weird unit in terms of its offensive capabilities. It's supposedly, I think, supposed to be because it's got Deadly Overwatch, your Overwatch unit, an option, but even with this, I'd rather have a good Overwatch from a unit that's like a Vanguard, just regular Trooper. I think all in all ends up being a bit more deadly than this guy. It's weird. It's a strange unit there. So next up, we've got access to the Shakarn Seeker. This is a water unit. I don't have to talk about that. I didn't research them in this particular playthrough, but they're all here. You've got access to the Propagator. This is your typical air unit. It's actually quite powerful. It's got the Sonar Repeater, the Disonos, which is essentially your missile that this thing fires. It's a lot like the Vanguard one. The Sonar Repeater has got okay damage, and then it's also got the air-to-air quality. It's got the stagger quality there. And then you've got the Disonos, which also causes stagger. And then you've got Hollow Mend, which is capable of healing a bunch of units, removing status effects, giving evasion. It's a fairly powerful all-around unit. It's got some pretty good stuff going on for it. Personally, I don't think that this is my favorite style of air unit, but at the same time, I just don't like the air units generally speaking, so if you're the sort of person who plays that, this is going to probably feel pretty comfortable to you. It's pretty powerful, I think, with all its stagger abilities and other things there. Next up, you've got access to the Firebrand. This is another unit that I'm not too sure about the role of it. It's got the Omni Claw, which is a pretty powerful ability. It's got 16 damage on it as a melee attack, which is pretty nuts. But this is kind of your tank unit. Like, this is where you would see the Vanguard tank or something like that, or the Psychic tank, or any of those sorts of things. It's got the Omni Shot, which is a short-range or mid-range sort of shotgun shot with Impaired on it. Impaired basically makes it so that your opponent can't use their mods during the duration of that, so it's pretty powerful actually, but it's not very much damage, so you're definitely not supposed to use this guy at that sort of range there. And it has got a charge ability through Staggering Force, but for a melee brute type unit, this guy's pretty expensive. I'm not too sure about him. I'm sure he's fine, it's just... yeah, it's a really weird unit. Like, its weapon here is tagged melee, laser, sonic, and claw. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Next up is the Tactician. This is another unit that I think is a bit confused. It's got the Sonoblast, which is a pretty powerful shotgun type effect again. Press the Advantage. This is a late ability considering what it is. Like, Siphons you can get much earlier. It's the same effect. It comes on a cheaper unit. I don't think Press the Advantage is enough to justify these guys. Fallback here is the same as the ability on that, the Abductor for the Void Tech. It's a good ability. It's actually a pretty decent heal, removes status effects, and it pulls them out of a dangerous position, but yeah, it's kind of a weird ability to have on this guy. I'm not too sure about that one. Then there's One of Us All Along. This is what makes this one, I think, quite powerful. It's a really long-range mind-influencing effect there, so I think that one is one of the ones that makes it a little bit better, but it's still a bit of a strange unit all in all. I'm not too sure where this fits into a lot of compositions there. It could be your support. It could be the one that you decide to use for support, since you don't really start with anything that can fit that role, but it's something that comes in quite late for that effect. Next up is the Refractor. This is your generic type of tank. It's a little bit more expensive than some of the other ones out there, but it does have pretty high damage output. It's a pretty good tank. It does most of the things you would expect there. Sonic Flow is basically a built-up version of an attack there, and you can do a bunch of extra damage if you've built up a bunch of Sonic Ebb up to 2 stacks there, so you can get a bit of extra damage on Sonic Flow that way. Definitely would be worth it if you got the chance to, but other than that, it's a pretty standard type of tank, all in all. And then lastly, you have Gamma Supremacy for the Shakarn. The Shakarn is a very bizarre unit, because unlike every other super unit in the game, this one I feel is almost entirely here for the offense purpose. The Omni Repeater here is capable of dealing a decent amount of damage, but it's less than your typical super unit. Like, 6/6 means that it's dealing 12 damage per shot, which you should be doing about 15 for something at this tier. Omni Charge is sort of where it's at here. It empowers the next Omni Beam to be 6 hex long, 3 hex wide line. This is basically just a gigantic area of the map. This is a gigantic amount of space that you're hitting with this. This is like multiple grenades sort of stacked together in terms of how large the effect area is. So this makes it so that you're going to be hitting a lot of your opponent's armies with the Omni Beam, which is pretty good damage, 26 damage there. has high impact for stagger and stuff like that. The thing is, 26 damage is still not really a ton. It's not enough that I would say that it makes the Shakarn actually worth it, but if you're able to hit like 6 units with this thing, which you could potentially be able to with it, it's pretty big, you're going to get some good value out of it. Anything short of that, though, and it's kind of a weird unit in that sort of sense there. Now, the other nice thing about it is it does have the defense mode Omni Shield, which means that it can go into defense mode, and it grants itself and everyone around it 3 points of shielding. This is quite a lot of that, as well as 15% evasion. This is one of the most powerful sort of defensive barrier type defense stances out there. But even so, it's kind of still more of a direct attack type unit, I would say. Omni Charge is nice in that it does throw you automatically into Omni Shield, so that does help a little bit there, but definitely not too sure about this unit as a thing on the field there, especially because Omni Beam functionally, unless you've got good lines every single turn, it's sort of doing half damage because you Omni Charge and then Omni Beam, and then you Omni Charge and then you Omni Beam, or you just keep Omni Beaming and potentially missing out on a lot of targets because you can only hit like 1 or 2 at a time with the smaller beam maybe. Very, very strange unit. Definitely do not recommend this one in particular. So anyhow, that's the unit overview for this faction. Let's get into this review sort of more the normal way. So first of all, Planetfall Procedures is going to be pretty much something that you just have. Homeworld Reminiscence is what you're going to probably be taking. Plus 12 food and plus 4 happiness. If you're on the coast or a river, you're going to want to make sure that that's happening if you're capable of doing so, or unless there's something really, really important, you're going to want to have that access to that bonus there. And Promethean doesn't change that one bit there. Propagation Towers, colony gains plus 4 happiness. More importantly, this can be applied later on for additional bonuses that you're capable of getting through those Propagation Towers. Phoenix Dawn Protocols, Phoenix Colonization Protocol, I don't necessarily think this is going to be super useful for you, especially because you tend not to find volcanic or hazards and stuff like that super close to rivers and coast, which is where you're going to probably be settling down a lot of the time. But if you have got hazardous terrain, you can just remove it. If you don't want to remove those, then you could, of course, use this, or if you're using those to sort of have the in-battle effects, then that can potentially be useful, but I still would really rarely use Phoenix Colonization Protocols. Next up is the Phoenix Armament Protocol. This is a great one, plus 25% cheaper, or 25% cheaper to build, 25% in reduced upkeep. This is pretty fantastic. It's going to synergize quite nicely with other things that we're going to see later. Next up, you have Manipulation Campaigns. Scorched Earth, I actually don't think this is very good. You think this would be quite nice with Promethean, but even though you're getting an increase in the amount of resources you gain from this by a quite decent amount there, I very rarely raise things in this game. It's much more common for me to keep hitting things and keep going and capturing stuff as I go, because that's one of the victory conditions. But also, if you are trying to raise stuff, you're sort of still have to keep babysitting it to prevent your opponent from taking it back, because not only will people just expand back into that area if you're not watching, whether it's your current fighting enemy or it's someone else, but if you don't take it, you still have to babysit it when you raise cities just for about as long as you would if you're annexing it. It's not much faster. So I just don't think it's that efficient to sort of use things like Scorched Earth policy. Next is Active Agents Networks. I think this is more useful and meaningful in easier difficulties or against real people, where you're much more likely to have info operation centers work properly, but this is actually a quite decent economic bonus there, plus 2 influence, and yeah, that having plus 2 influence per turn from something per each event is pretty powerful and a great way to farm a lot of influence if you're going sort of that route there. Next up is the Phoenix Nighttide Protocols. The Extermination Protocols, again, plus 10% damage for free, basically. Not great, considering how late game it is and stuff like that, but it's not bad either. And of course, plus 20% if you're up against Xenoplague is really, really good. So it's situationally okay, and situationally very, very good, depending on what you're up against there. Phoenix Defense Protocol, again, I prefer being on the offense whenever I need to be, but if you do need to defend yourself, especially against operations, Phoenix Defense Protocols is pretty up there as far as those sort of things. Lastly, you've got Expert Council. Now, there's a sort of lore thing going on with these guys where they've got 2 sort of philosophies that are competing. You've either got Domok, which is the direct damage sort of thing there. plus 10% damage, plus 10% accuracy, and their upkeep reduced by 20%. Combine this with Phoenix protocols, and you've got a pretty big upkeep reduction there. Then you've also got access to the Zardoz channels. This is the more infiltratory side of things there. Covert operations cost less to prime, and you gain plus 3 operational defense. Infiltrators now deal plus 30% damage, though, even when hollow shifted. So if you're going for a very heavy infiltrator build, which you can do, absolutely, then holocrafted Zardoz channels is ridiculous in terms of how much it's giving you in terms of value. You can still use, I think, that along with Titan Domok Regiment. I do think you're allowed to use both. I'm just not in this particular case. But operational already active, no slots more for more. I'm just going to try something real quick here. Yeah, you can use both. For heroes like the Domok and Zardoz stuff is mutually exclusive. The reason I'm not doing this is because I don't have infiltrators, though, so I just didn't never check. Yeah, like that's kind of the way that works there. You've got the ability to gain huge bonuses to the damage on those guys. So even if you're not doing operation stuff, this is pretty good. And also plus 3 operation defense is, in my opinion, better than the operation offense against the very hard AI or the impossible AI, just because they throw operations at you all the time, specifically stealing all your goddamn money. Pretty annoying sort of stuff there. So anyhow, let's take a look at the military side of things again here, and take a look at how Promethean sort of melds with all this. So first of all, you've got access to the Purification Field and the Hazmat Protector. Hazmat Protection, of course, is, as always, very situational, but is pretty powerful in those situations, and Purification Field is just really, really good all around. One of the reasons I would say that the Purification Field is actually better for these guys is that so many of their units are vulnerable to status effects that you really want to have the ability to purge those status effects there. Next up is the Purifier Core, and these guys are a bit unique. These guys are melee. They've got the Plasma Claw, they've got the Launch Plasma Bomb. They're all in all a pretty powerful unit if they're capable of getting to you, and unlike a lot of melee units, they do have some anti-air capability. The Plasma Bomb can be used against air units. The reason that I don't necessarily think these guys are the best out there is that being melee does make them more limited in terms of their use compared to the ones that can fire more long-distance repeating shots, but they are one of the ones that are up there in terms of their damage output, so I'm not really sure where to put them. The fact that they're melee in such close range is also a reason why I would say that they play a bit differently with the upgrades. So, first of all is the Thermal Targeting Relay. This is a really great mod for these guys still, but not for their purifiers, because again, you don't necessarily need something like the Thermal Targeting Array on one of your melee units, but what makes this guy a little bit different is that they're really good with the Purex absorption panels. If you've got basically the ability to throw some sort of fire down with your basic troops there, the Raiders, and then have your Purifiers up front with the panels, they're going to be able to stand in that fire and be in melee combat where you're aiming those shots anyway. This means you're not wasting shots prepping the ground for your troops to stand on so that they get the Purex absorption panel procs. Instead, the terrain's already going to be on fire because you're targeting those specific enemies, and then you can charge the Purifiers on top of that. Works really, really well, in my opinion. For the Aegis tanks, I don't build them with these guys, even though they're actually pretty good with them. Being able to sort of defend your units a little bit better with their shielding effect there, the Fallout Shield, does let you get into close combat a little bit more easily, but I just don't think it's that necessary. The Purifier is actually already a fairly tough and durable unit, so I don't think that that's hugely necessary. Combine that between the epimorphic regeneration and the fact that you're probably going to have some other things like Purifier, whatever the hell it's called, what is this? The Purification Fields, as well as potentially Purex absorption panels. You're going to end up in a situation where they're capable of getting into close combat just fine. Next up is the superheated plasma actuators. Being able to deal immolation instead of burning is actually really, really powerful. It's a strong ability, but you don't need it. It's not really that necessary. So throw it on if you feel like you've got extra space for it, and don't use it if you don't feel like you've got that extra space for it. Backlash projectors, again, these are way more useful for these guys' purifiers, just because they're going to be in that melee range, so you're going to get those backlash projector procs a lot more often than others. And having armor on them instead of other things is a little bit more useful than other people. Phoenix Walker, again, I think it's a bit too expensive and a bit too clunky for what it is. I don't think that top tier units being melee is really a great way for them to be, just because they attract a lot of fire anyhow, and by the time they get into melee combat, they're probably already dead, so not really my favorite sort of unit there. Although, you know, them dying, I guess, getting into melee means other units can get in there safely. Phoenix Bombs, these things are really good still. I just think that they're really powerful all around. In this case, I think that actually you don't necessarily want to throw them onto your purifiers, just because of the way that they're going to be playing. The way that I played this particular game, though, I was playing mine in kind of a stupid grenade-y fashion. I replaced one of them eventually, but the way I was playing my guys was with the Impairing Grenade and the Phoenix Bomb Launcher, and for a lot of the game, they would just sort of throw ordnance at people so that they wouldn't have to use their melee attack, but there's nothing wrong with their melee attack. It just meant that as I was advancing on my enemy, I was just chucking stuff at them the entire time. It was kind of a funny build, but I would not say it's necessarily the best one. I think that the best one for these guys is Backlash Projectors, Pyrrhic Absorption Panels, and then whatever sort of offense upgrade you potentially want. I actually really think that the best one is probably up here, but we'll get to that once we get to that. So, yeah, that's pretty much how I view most of the stuff down here. I definitely think that the Phoenix Bomb Launchers are still going to be something that you throw on all of your backline troops, but unfortunately it really is just Raiders that it's going to end up being on there, so it's a little bit unfortunate in that sort of sense. You've got access to Sonic and Laser. I would actually have recommended Laser, just because, of course, that gives you some access to burning, but you're going to have some units that are going to be using the Sonic weaponry anyhow, so you could go through either trade. I would actually recommend just not going through either. You don't really need it in particular here. So first of all, for their faction upgrades, you've got access to portable scanners. These things do allow you to apply Analyzed onto the enemy. Now, if you're going to use it for that purpose, what I really would recommend is just having a dedicated type of unit for them to go around hitting people with their weapon to scan them. And the reason that I would sort of say that I would want to do this is because you don't want it to be on everybody. Like, you don't need to scan everything every single shot. But this isn't the best module other than that effect there. In fact, most of the time I would just say skip it, but if you really like the Analyzed effect, it is pretty powerful. So you could definitely get some mileage out of it against really tough sort of opponents there. Next up is that Impairing Grenade. This is a pretty powerful grenade. It deals a decent amount of stagger, but more importantly, it does have Impaired, which means that that unit cannot gain benefits from their modules, and this is a really, really powerful sort of status effect that is kind of annoying to have to deal with, so I do think that it's a pretty powerful module, but it being a grenade does kind of suck a little bit. Raiders, I think, can benefit from it, but you can also have a really funny Purifier that uses that. It is actually potentially really important on Purifiers, just because there are a bunch of things out there that people could potentially have that might be reducing your damage output with your fire if you're up against another Promethean sort of player. Next up is the Xeno Defense module. If you're up against a faction that's really mono damage, then Xeno Defense module is really powerful, plus 3 damage resistance to the last damage type it received. So if you keep getting hit by the same damage over and over and over again, plus 3 damage resistance is really a pretty powerful thing. But a lot of the time I find I'm getting hit by a pretty big mix of things. I would say that it's most useful if there's like no minor factions where people can just buy units that have a new damage type or something like that. Next up is the Hollow Displacement Shields. Hollow Displacement Shields are actually pretty powerful. Skitter's pretty powerful effect there. I do think that this is one of the mods that works pretty well on something like the Purifiers, so if you are going for those guys, this could potentially be something you want to do. If you want to have them sort of sneak in close to the enemy without getting hit, and especially like it's one of the ones that you could throw on them and have it replaced later. Next up, you've got access to weighted holograms. Now, this isn't actually an upgrade or anything, but it automatically applies to your infiltrators. I just want to point this out here. So infiltrators, even though they can't have mods, end up with pretty decent stats because they're capable of using these things. So they're a pretty powerful unit when they've got all their bonuses rolling. Next up, you've got access to the orbital recall system. And this is basically a repositioning ability. The only problem is it's still way, way, way weaker than the jetpacks. But it is nice because you can apply it to any unit, so you can use this on your heavier stuff there. The other complaint I have about this is the graphic design here. I mean, this just, there's something, this reminds me a little bit of a thing, and I don't like it. Anyway, so next up, we've got access to the exoskeleton. This is a fantastic mod, and I would definitely say that this is one I would recommend using for your your purifiers. So plus 25% critical chance, plus 20% accuracy, which is kind of iffy on these guys, but it also gives you stagger resistance and plus 2 armor. So while the plus 20% accuracy is completely unnecessary on that kind of unit, plus 25% critical is absolutely fantastic. You need stagger resistance and stagger immunity on melee units whenever you can get those, and plus 2 armor is a really nice thing for that sort of unit as well. Hollow Reality Mantle, this does a lot of stuff there. This allows you to do a bunch of weird things. For one thing, instead of reflecting damage when you get hit, you have a small chance of disabling your opponent through hallucination, which is a pretty okay status effect. It's actually pretty powerful. Or you can use Hollow Real Cover, and I would say that if you're going to use something like this, you could dedicate like a specific build to going for a bunch of support type jank, including this sort of thing. I don't necessarily know that it's important to have something like this. I really don't know how I feel about Hollow Reality Mantle as a mod there, but it's got some real potential to it. I just haven't figured out necessarily what I think the best use of this is. Being able to apply hallucinating, though, it's a powerful status effect, though, so I do think that the Hollow Reality Mantle is a pretty powerful mod. At this level, you also get lifelike holograms. All infiltrator units you gain control gain plus 2 shield and plus 10% damage, so pretty powerful there. And then over here we get access to the Gamma Omnitech research for the Omni activation. Your units gain resurgence, which means they come back to life after the battle unless their corpse has been destroyed, and there's a couple things that do that. And at the start of the next turn, the unit gains Insanity, attacking enemy units at random for 3 turns. During this time, they also gain 30% damage, increase in plus 3 resistance to all damage channels. So basically, this is a way to turn your units into crazy berserkers, where they sort of like switch on and then sort of go nuts amidst the enemy. And if they die, it doesn't really matter. I don't like losing control of my units personally, but this can definitely be quite powerful, especially if you can get your entire stack in there and use trigger phrase systems on all of them, because it's a lot of extra damage. It's a lot of damage resistance, which is quite nice to have, and resurgence means that you don't really care that they're getting killed in the process. But if you need to do something very vital, like take out a very key enemy unit, then trigger phrase systems are going to really hurt you in those instances, and if your entire stack gets wiped out, obviously you don't get to resurgence, so a little bit tricky there. Then you've got holochromatic engines. I actually have not been able to properly figure out what this actually does. So reading the text here, this unit gains 1 level of stagger resistance. When this unit takes enemy damage, it gains a free action damaging ability of the same damage channel. I'm pretty sure what I've seen this do is that if you get hit by something, you get to use a free action to cause a special attack, but I'm not entirely sure that it's all that amazing. It's kind of like a damage reflect with extra steps in a lot of ways, so I'm not really sure what the point of this is in some ways, but it is pretty powerful on paper there, so it could potentially be something that you could do something interesting with. Alright, so that is pretty much everything. Like I said, a lot of these things are going to mesh well with stuff like the Purification Field and the Thermal Targeting Array. A lot of your other units you could throw on, for example, the Pyrrhic Absorption Panels on something like the Firebrand, but ultimately I wouldn't build the Firebrand. I just would build Purifiers instead of that. They're a better unit in a lot of respects there. They've got better modifications that can be put on them. I wouldn't build things like the Tactician in this particular instance unless I was using that as my sort of weird, dedicated, like Hollow Reality scanning support type thing, and have it sort of do a lot of weird stuff while it was out there, but ultimately, what you want to do with this faction, I think, is focus down on a lot of Purifiers and your sort of lower tier units. I think that they're all going to be quite fine for you. So anyhow, let's take a look at some of my combinations here. So these are not necessarily the ones as finalized, but here we have some raiders that have got the Thermal Targeting Array. They got the Purification Field as well as the Phoenix Bomb Launchers. This lets them sort of have that long range attack that really rounds out their inventory, because like they've got a really powerful sort of mid-short range ability there, but throwing on that Phoenix Bomb Launcher means that they've got something to do on that opening turn, force the enemy forward into carbine range, and then you can sort of open up on them and deal a lot of damage that way. Really sort of a fantastic way to play this unit. There are other ways to play them. You've got this earlier version that had the disarming grenade there, pretty powerful. Infiltrator, obviously, I can't upgrade those in any way, shape, or form, so they just have to be as they are. The Deadeyes I haven't upgraded. I started with one. I just I'm not entirely sure why you would use these guys over the Raiders, because Raiders do what they do, but better in a lot of senses there. You're supposed to use this thing, I think, for sniping with the Perforator ability, but it's just not very strong. Next up, you've got my Purifier, and this, as you can see, has been the mainstay of what I've been doing here. This is a build I don't really recommend. I've got the Impairing Grenade, I've got the Exoskeleton, and I've got the Bomb Launchers. This worked okay in this particular build, but it was more sort of a funny way of playing it. What I would definitely say is more efficient with these guys is for you to go with something like the Pyrrhic Absorption Panels and the Backlash Projectors and the Assault Exoskeleton. And this combination is going to let these guys run straight into the middle of combat while dealing a ton of extra damage. They're going to be shrugging off tons of damage. They've got lots and lots of armor unless they're getting hit by sonic attacks there. They're going to be hitting really hard. They're going to be accurate with their launch plasma bombs because they do still have a ranged attack there. And they're going to be healing up a ton from all the fires you're going to be setting. And I would say not to spam this build too heavily, because what you're going to need to do is to really back these guys up with some of your other units launching fire across there. Like, these guys are going to have to be launching those Phoenix bombs across the map there so that they can really take advantage of that. It's kind of a 50-50 sort of thing, I would say, or even maybe less than that. Now, I haven't actually built anything past there in the tech tree. This was a fairly quick game in terms of that, so I haven't been able to get through as much tech there, but there are some other things you can do with some of the other units that I don't have access to yet that are pretty good. So, for example, if you really wanted to, the Firebrand can be deployed in a lot of the same ways as your Purifiers. Obviously, they don't have access to this thing. What is interesting about these guys is that they become super durable. You can end up with ones that are pretty hard to kill. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily the best of qualities, but when you've got something that's got like 16 base damage, that's pretty tough. You're going to end up in a really interesting situation. Again, the Shakarn Tactician, it's kind of sketchy as to using that guy, but it is pretty powerful. And what's nice about the Refractor is that if you find yourself up against a ton of people who can take a lot of fire resistance, this is a different damage channel and is quite high damage. Like I was talking, the top tier units usually have something like in the vicinity of 15 damage. In this case, having it on the Refractor, which doesn't pay quite as much as a top tier unit, it's still not like excessively high compared to those, but it still means it's in there with that sort of tier of unit. Sonic Flow is also pretty powerful once it's gotten charged up as well, so it's pretty nice as well to be able to sort of go through the Sonic tree, I guess, in the sense that if you are up against people who have a lot of fire resistance, you can use this tree to do some pretty interesting damage there. But I've been going through their mods and stuff like that. Their mods, to me, are a little bit difficult to apply if you're up against somebody and you're using the Promethean stuff. I think that the Promethean stuff just is plenty powerful as far as your offense capabilities go. That's one of the nice things about Promethean, is you don't have to rely on your weapon damage types under normal circumstances. So anyhow, that's everything I've got to say about the... well, actually, let's take a look at some of my armies if I can find them. And this one I've gotten just a lot of random things that I've purchased, so we've got lots of bees over here. Here we've got a stack that's like 3 Purifiers, as well as a couple of these Infiltrators, again, no upgrades, as well as a Raider. Again, I would say more Raiders and stuff like that next time, maybe a few less Infiltrators, but they're pretty okay, especially late game when you don't have a ton of Cosmite. Throw out some Infiltrators. They cost 10 Cosmite, but that's not that much late game. We have this Deadeye that I don't know what to do with, and we've got a couple of Raiders. Pretty simple stuff there. Like, Raiders are pretty powerful, and the Purifiers are very powerful. To a certain extent, I've been playing this game just by spamming out units as fast as possible, including getting allied units from the minor factions, but like, their basic units are really quite strong. Like, the damage outputs on them are just higher than a lot of other factions, and the Purifier is just a really sort of fantastic unit for these guys as far as just being able to dish out huge amounts of damage goes. Not a very subtle combination, which I think is meant to be part of their playbook, is being a bit more subtle, but I definitely think that they're a pretty good faction all around. So anyhow, that's going to be our video for today. Hope you found this one enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.